A phone call can be a weapon. A word can be a poison. And a broken heart, it can literally kill you. This is not the story of Ernest Hemingway you've heard 1,000 times. This is the story of Pauline Pfeiffer, the woman history branded a villain, but who was actually his greatest champion and his ultimate victim. She fueled his career with her mind, her ambition, and her family's fortune. In return, she was cast aside. But this isn't just another tale of a tragic love affair. This is a medical mystery wrapped in a literary legacy, a story of a secret, ticking time bomb inside a woman's body, detonated by one final brutal act of cruelty. It's time to set the record straight. To understand Pauline, you have to understand the world that forged her, a world poised on the thrilling, terrifying cusp of modernity. While we often picture the 1920s as a dizzying kaleidoscope of flappers and jazz, for a young woman from Piggott, Arkansas, it was something more, a promise of a life unbound by the stiff conventions of her parents' generation. Pauline Marie Pfeiffer wasn't born into the bohemian chaos of Paris. She was a daughter of the American heartland, but one with extraordinary privilege. Her father, Paul Pfeiffer, was a wealthy land developer, and her uncle, Gustavus Pfeiffer, was the head of a pharmaceutical and cosmetics empire. The Pfeiffers were pillars of their community, devout Catholics, philanthropists, and people of immense influence. Pauline and her sister Virginia, known as Ginny, grew up in a world of comfort, educated at the best Catholic schools, and imbued with a sense of quiet confidence that only old money can truly bestow. But Pauline was never destined to be a simple society wife. There was a current of ambition running deep within her. She attended the prestigious University of Missouri School of Journalism, a remarkable step for a woman of her time and social standing. She was sharp, intelligent, with a keen eye for fashion, and a talent for writing that was concise and incisive. She wasn't just playing at having a career, she was building one. And so she did what so many bright, ambitious young Americans did in the 1920s. She went to Paris, but she didn't go as a wide-eyed tourist. She arrived as a professional. By 1925, Pauline had landed a coveted position as a writer and editor for the Paris edition of Vogue. This was the pinnacle of chic, the arbiter of taste for an entire generation. Pauline, with her impeccable style, always dressed in the latest Chanel or Schiaparelli, and her sharp, witty prose, fit right in. Imagine her then, a woman in her late 20s, financially independent, professionally successful, navigating the most exciting city in the world. She wasn't a struggling artist. She was a power player in her own right, moving through the glittering salons and smoky cafes of the lost generation, not as a muse, but as a peer. She was sophisticated, worldly, and in complete control of her own destiny, or so she thought, because in that very city, in that very year, she was about to meet a man whose talent was as immense as his capacity for destruction, a man who would rewrite her entire life. The story of how Pauline Pfeiffer met Ernest Hemingway is almost always told as a simple, sordid triangle. There's Ernest, the brilliant, struggling writer on the cusp of fame. There's his wife, Hadley Richardson, the gentle, nurturing soul who had supported him through the lean years. And then there's Pauline, the stylish, wealthy other woman who swooped in and tore it all apart. But like most things in Hemingway's orbit, the truth was far more complex and far more painful. They were introduced in late 1925 by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Pauline and her sister Ginny quickly became friends with Ernest and Hadley. At first, the friendship was entirely platonic. They were a foursome, part of the vibrant American expatriate community. Pauline was a frequent guest at the Hemingways' small apartment above a sawmill. She adored their little boy, Jack, nicknamed Bumby, and developed a genuine affection for Hadley. From the outside, Pauline seemed to have everything Hadley lacked. Where Hadley was maternal and increasingly weary of their hand-to-mouth existence, Pauline was sleek, modern, and exciting. She had a press pass that got her into exclusive events, a generous expense account, and an insider's knowledge of the glamorous world of high fashion and high society. She was a breath of fresh, expensive air. Hemingway was, of course, captivated. But this was more than just a simple infatuation. Pauline represented a different kind of life. She was a portal to a world of sophistication and success that he desperately craved. She didn't just admire his work, she understood the industry. She could talk to him about publishing, about reputation, about the very mechanics of fame. The affair began in the spring of 1926. It was a period of intense deception and guilt. Hemingway would later write about it with agonizing self-recrimination in his memoir, A Movable Feast. He cast himself as the villain, tormented by his betrayal of Hadley. But in doing so, he also subtly stripped Pauline of her own agency, painting her as a determined seductress. The truth is, Pauline was as swept away as he was. She was a devout Catholic, and the affair tormented her conscience. But she was also deeply, irrevocably in love. Here was this man, this force of nature whose talent she recognized as seismic. He was raw, charismatic, and brilliant. He was writing The Sun Also Rises, the novel that would make him a literary icon. And Pauline was there, a witness to its creation. She offered him not just adoration, but professional advice, using her sharp editor's eye to suggest cuts and changes. The summer of 1926 was the breaking point. The Hemingways, Pauline, and a group of friends went to Pamplona for the Festival of San Fermin, the very trip that had inspired The Sun Also Rises. But this time, the carefree atmosphere was poisoned by the secret affair. Hadley, no longer blind to the situation, was forced to watch the undeniable connection between her husband and her friend. The tension was unbearable. Upon their return to the French Riviera, Hadley confronted Ernest. The 100 days of separation that followed were a period of agony for all three. Hadley behaved with a dignity that was almost heartbreaking. She told Ernest that if he and Pauline could stay apart for 100 days and still loved each other at the end of it, she would grant him a divorce. Pauline, for her part, suffered intensely. Her letters from this period reveal a woman racked with guilt and longing. She wrote to Ernest, "I am the guiltiest person in the world, but I am not a bit sorry." It's a striking admission, a testament to the overwhelming power of her love for him. She knew the damage she was causing. She felt the weight of her sin, but she could not and would not turn back. Ernest, caught between two women he loved in very different ways, vacillated. But the pull of Pauline and the glamorous, successful life she represented was too strong. The 100 days passed. The love remained. In January 1927, Hadley and Ernest's divorce was finalized. Less than 4 months later, on May 10, 1927, Ernest Hemingway married Pauline Pfeiffer. She had won. She had gotten her man. But the victory came with a heavy price, a shadow of guilt that would follow her for the rest of her life, and a quiet tragedy that was only just beginning to unfold. The new Mrs. Hemingway was not content to be a mere appendage to her famous husband. She was a partner, a collaborator, and in many ways, the architect of the Hemingway legend. With the divorce from Hadley settled, Pauline's family money came into play, and it changed everything. The days of struggling in a cold water flat in Paris were over. The era of Hemingway, the global icon, had begun. Their first home together was in Key West, Florida. It wasn't the tourist hotspot it is today. It was a remote, slightly ramshackle island outpost. But Pauline with her unerring eye for style and comfort, transformed it. In 1931, her wealthy Uncle Gus bought them the now famous house at 907 Whitehead Street. It was a dilapidated Spanish colonial mansion, but Pauline saw its potential. She oversaw a massive renovation, turning it into a luxurious sanctuary. She had a lush tropical garden planted filled with exotic flowers she had shipped in. Most famously, she commissioned the first swimming pool in the Florida Keys. The cost was an astronomical $20,000 in 1930s money, the equivalent of over $400,000 today. The legend goes that when Ernest found out how much it cost, he took a penny from his pocket, pressed it into the wet concrete of the patio, and declared, "Here, you might as well take my last cent." That penny is still there today, a monument to Pauline's largesse and Ernest's theatrical charm. This house was more than just a home. It was a meticulously crafted environment designed for one purpose: to allow Ernest Hemingway to write. Pauline converted a carriage house in the garden into a private writing studio, a sacred space where he could work undisturbed. She managed the household, entertained a constant stream of famous guests, and created a buffer between her husband's volatile genius and the demands of the outside world. Her contribution was not merely financial or domestic. She was his first and most trusted reader. She had a formidable intellect and a sharp editorial sense honed at Vogue. It was Pauline who read the manuscript for A Farewell to Arms, his masterpiece born from the ashes of his relationship with Hadley. She offered critical feedback, suggesting he cut long, philosophical passages and focus on the raw, emotional core of the story. But one of her suggestions has become a point of intense literary debate. The original ending of A Farewell to Arms was bleak and uncertain. Pauline, a devout Catholic who desperately wanted a happy ending in her own life, pushed for something more hopeful. Hemingway wrote dozens of different endings, over 40 by some counts, struggling to get it right. While the final published ending is far from happy, many scholars believe Pauline's influence softened its nihilistic edge. Was she protecting his commercial appeal, or was she projecting her own deep-seated need for love and commitment to triumph over tragedy? It's a question that reveals the complex entanglement of their personal and professional lives. During these Key West years, they seemed to have it all. They traveled the world on safari in Africa. They went deep-sea fishing in the Gulf Stream. They lived a life of adventure and glamour that fueled his writing and his public persona. And Pauline gave him two sons, Patrick, born in 1928, and Gregory, born in 1931. But the birth of their children brought with it a profound hidden wound. Pauline was a small woman with narrow hips. The birth of Patrick was excruciatingly difficult, requiring a cesarean section. The doctors warned her that another pregnancy would be life-threatening. For Pauline, a devout Catholic, this was a devastating blow. Her faith forbade contraception, placing her in an impossible position: risk her life or live in a state of mortal sin. This conflict created a deep and painful rift in their marriage. Hemingway, a man of immense physical appetites, grew frustrated and distant. They tried to maintain intimacy through other means, but a chill had entered their relationship. It was a private, agonizing struggle, a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario that Pauline had to navigate in silence. She was the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect manager of his career. But a fundamental part of their marriage was fractured, and it was a fracture that would never truly heal. The golden couple of Key West had a secret, and that secret was slowly, quietly pulling them apart. Every great story needs a turning point, a moment where the intricate tapestry begins to unravel. For Pauline Pfeiffer, that moment had a name: Martha Gellhorn. If Pauline represented the sophisticated, settled life of a literary lion, Martha was a return to the wild. She was a brilliant, fiercely ambitious war correspondent, a writer in her own right who wasn't content to stand in anyone's shadow. They met ironically in Key West. It was Christmas of 1936. Martha, bold and utterly self-assured, walked into Sloppy Joe's bar and into Ernest Hemingway's life. Hemingway was restless. The domestic tranquility of Key West, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. The Spanish Civil War was raging, and it called to him. It was the kind of raw, brutal conflict that had always been the crucible of his best work. Martha Gellhorn was his ticket back to that world. She wasn't asking for a swimming pool or a quiet studio. She was heading to the front lines, and she challenged him to go with her. The affair that began in Spain was a mirror image of the one that had started with Pauline a decade earlier, but with a cruel twist. This time, Pauline was the wife left behind. She was Hadley. She did not, however, react like Hadley. Pauline was a fighter. She had invested everything in this marriage: her reputation, her fortune, her faith, her very identity. She wasn't going to let it go without a fight. She refused to grant him a divorce, clinging to the hope that this was just another one of his infatuations, that he would eventually tire of the grit and danger of war and return to the comfort she had so carefully constructed for him. She tried everything. She visited him in Spain, a desperate attempt to reclaim her territory. Imagine the scene. Pauline, always impeccably dressed, a creature of Parisian salons and Key West luxury, trying to find her place amidst the dust and chaos of a war zone, while the formidable Martha Gellhorn was in her element, filing stories from the front. It was a losing battle. For 4 agonizing years, Pauline held on. She endured the humiliation of being the spurned wife, a role she had once inflicted on another. Hemingway, for his part, was torn. He still felt a deep bond with Pauline, a sense of loyalty and gratitude. He was the father of her children. He would write her letters from Spain, filled with a strange mixture of affection and guilt, even as his passion for Martha consumed him. One of the most revealing and rarely discussed incidents from this period speaks volumes about Pauline's quiet desperation. While Ernest was away, she undertook a massive redecoration of their Key West home. She filled it with Spanish furniture and art, attempting to create a Spanish setting to lure him back. It was a heartbreakingly literal attempt to compete with the country that had stolen her husband. She was trying to prove that she, too, could be a part of his world of adventure, that he didn't need to leave home to find the Spanish soul he so admired. But he wasn't in love with Spain. He was in love with Martha. The controversy here is not just about infidelity. It's about the very nature of Hemingway's genius. Some biographers argue that he required a new woman for each new phase of his literary life. Hadley was the muse of Paris and poverty. Pauline was the muse of ambition and worldly success, and Martha was the muse of political conscience and war. In this interpretation, the women were not just partners, they were catalysts, necessary sacrifices for his art. It's a debatable and deeply unsettling view. It reduces these complex, intelligent women to mere fuel for a man's creative fire. Pauline was never just a muse. She was a co-creator of his life and his legend. But in the end, her love and her fortune were not enough to hold him. By 1940, the fight was over. Hemingway wrote to her, formally ending their marriage. On November 4th, 1940, Pauline Pfeiffer, after 13 years as Mrs. Ernest Hemingway, was granted a divorce on the grounds of desertion. 3 weeks later, he married Martha Gellhorn. Pauline remained in the house in Key West, the beautiful, sun-drenched monument to a life that was now over. She never remarried. She dedicated herself to her sons, Patrick and Gregory, and to her Catholic faith. Outwardly, she maintained her composure and her dignity. But inwardly, a quiet tragedy was entering its final devastating act. She had survived the divorce, but the deepest wound was yet to come, inflicted by the man she never stopped loving. The story of Pauline Pfeiffer could have ended there, with the quiet dignity of a woman scorned, but not broken. She could have been remembered simply as the wife who was replaced, but her story has a final chapter, a dark and shocking conclusion that is so often overlooked. Yet it is the very key to understanding the depth of her quiet tragedy. It's a story about a mother's love, a son's turmoil, and a single, frantic telephone call that proved fatal. After the divorce, Pauline continued to live a life of quiet elegance. She divided her time between Key West and California, remaining a devoted, if sometimes anxious, mother to her two sons. Patrick, the elder, was generally stable, but Gregory, her youngest, known as Gigi, was a source of constant worry. He was a deeply troubled young man grappling with a fierce desire to please his hyper-masculine father while secretly struggling with his gender identity. A conflict that in the 1950s was not just taboo, but pathologized. He would later undergo gender reassignment surgery and live as Gloria, but during Pauline's lifetime, his inner turmoil manifested in episodes of erratic behavior. Ernest's relationship with Gigi was fraught. He adored his son, but was also brutally critical of him, unable to comprehend or accept Gigi's sensitive nature. Pauline was the constant mediator, the loving buffer between a demanding father and a vulnerable son. On the last day of September, 1951, this fragile family dynamic shattered. Gigi, who was then living in California, was arrested. He had been attending a film at a local theater when he entered the women's restroom. Accounts differ on the specifics. Some say he was wearing women's clothing, others that he was simply in a confused state. Regardless, he was taken into custody. Gigi, in a panic, used his one phone call to call not his mother but his father, who was now living in Cuba with his fourth wife, Mary. The call was a disaster. Ernest, who had been drinking, flew into a rage. He berated his son, blaming him for bringing shame upon the family name. The conversation was cruel and unforgiving. Immediately after hanging up on his son, Ernest did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He picked up the phone and called Pauline. We can only imagine the conversation that followed. It's a moment of private horror that history has thankfully left unrecorded in its verbatim cruelty. But we know its substance. Ernest, furious and agitated, unleashed a torrent of blame on Pauline. He accused her of being a bad mother, of coddling Gigi, of being responsible for his son's perceived failings. He told her about the arrest, about the cross-dressing, about the shame of it all. He took all of his own complex feelings of anger, disappointment, and perhaps even guilt, and aimed them directly at the woman who had once been the center of his world. Pauline, on the other end of the line in California, listened to this verbal assault. She would have been terrified for her son and devastated by the venom coming from the man she still loved. The shock, the stress, the anguish of that moment was unimaginable. What happened next is the quiet medical fact upon which this whole tragedy turns. Shortly after that phone call, Pauline complained of a severe pain in her abdomen. She collapsed. Her sister Ginny, who was with her, rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. Within hours, in the early morning of October 1st, 1951, Pauline Pfeiffer died. She was only 56 years old. The official cause of death was listed as shock. For years, that was the end of the story. A sensitive woman had died from the shock of a terrible phone call. A sad but vague conclusion. But it wasn't the whole story. Gregory, tormented by guilt over his role in his mother's death, eventually became a doctor himself. He was determined to understand what had really happened. He managed to obtain his mother's autopsy report, and what he found was staggering. Pauline had been suffering from a rare and completely undiagnosed medical condition called a pheochromocytoma. It's a tumor of the adrenal gland that secretes massive amounts of adrenaline. While often benign, the tumor is a ticking time bomb. Any sudden surge of extreme emotional or physical stress can cause it to rupture, releasing a fatal dose of adrenaline into the bloodstream, leading to a massive spike in blood pressure, a stroke, and a heart attack. The final heated phone call from Ernest Hemingway had not just broken her heart metaphorically, it had, in all medical likelihood, literally killed her. The intense stress of that conversation was the trigger that caused the tumor to burst. Ernest's rage-fueled words had been the final fatal blow. This is the hidden detail, the rarely discussed fact that reframes Pauline's entire life. She was not just a casualty of a broken heart in a poetic sense. She was a direct, physical casualty of the emotional violence that so often swirled around Ernest Hemingway. Her quiet tragedy wasn't just about lost love or the pain of divorce. It was about carrying a secret, physical vulnerability that made her uniquely susceptible to the very man she had given her life to. He had been her greatest love and, in the end, her unwitting executioner. So what is the legacy of Pauline Pfeiffer? Why does her quiet story still matter, more than 70 years after her tragic death? For so long, she has been a supporting character in a drama that wasn't her own. She was the second wife, a name on a list, a footnote in the grand, noisy narrative of a great American author. But to see her that way is to miss the point entirely. Pauline's story is a powerful reminder of the unseen labor and emotional toll carried by women behind great men. Far from a passive muse, she actively shaped Hemingway's life, funding his writing, editing his work, and building a home that sustained his genius. He crafted the myth, she built the foundation. Her life challenges the simplistic, often sexist labels history imposes. She wasn't a homewrecker, but a woman who loved deeply and paid dearly. Burdened by expectations, to be a perfect wife, to manage a difficult genius, to uphold a fractured faith, to care for a troubled child, she bore silent pressures until her body gave out. Her death reveals a painful truth. Heartbreak can be fatal. Emotional wounds leave physical marks, sometimes invisible until it's too late. Her son Gregory, who carried guilt for her death, honored her in his memoir as the quiet center of their chaotic world, a woman whose body bore the cost of a lifetime of emotional strain. In the end, Pauline Pfeiffer's story isn't about the man she married. It's about the quiet strength it takes to love someone so completely, and the immense, often invisible cost of that devotion. It's a reminder that the loudest legacies don't always belong to the people who made the most noise. Sometimes the most enduring stories are the quietest ones, the ones that force us to listen closer, to look past the glare of fame and into the fragile, beautiful, and ultimately tragic heart of a life well lived and unfairly lost. Pauline Pfeiffer deserves to be remembered not just as Hemingway's wife, but as the woman who loved him, who shaped him, and who, in the quietest way imaginable, was a casualty of that very love. Her tragedy was her silence, and her legacy is the story that silence tells. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.